All right, welcome back to Rising Stronger Radio. I'm your host, Keith, and today we're joined by Darian. You go by Darian, right?
Yeah, either one is fine.
Okay. Or Orthodox Soul on YouTube, which is where I came to find him. And Darian, can we start out with you just giving us an overview of your journey so far and your life story?
Sure, yeah. A lot of people have come to my channel through the testimony video that I put out where I sort of covered my journey as someone who was not raised in the faith and didn't really have any kind of a spiritual formation growing up. No foundation provided for me in any kind of explicit terms from anyone in the family. There's always, those like little hints and elements of just like a lingering, after image of what the older generation was raised to believe. So there was like certain hints at, you know, my grandmother was brought up in the Catholic Church, and so was my mom, who's from Europe, and everything is like predominantly Roman Catholic over there. Um, so it was around, it was sort of at the periphery in some sense, but I wasn't being taught the scriptures or anything that would really bring it to the forefront of my mind. We didn't go to church or anything like that. These things just weren't discussed in my family. And so as I kind of went through the journey of childhood and young, my teenage years, young adulthood, it was a lot of sort of just scrambling to figure things out and trying to put pieces together to a puzzle that I didn't even know was a puzzle. I didn't even know there were pieces missing. It was a lot of just fumbling around in the dark, so to speak. And because of God's grace, I see now in retrospect the way that a lot of these things were tied together, and they were really necessary aspects of the journey to make everything make sense later on. Um, but yeah, it was really hard for a lot of years, going through certain uh, existential crises, if you will, that were brought on by, certain health issues that began happening that really served as what was ultimately the catalyst for the journey into the faith. But before that, it was a lot of years of just kind of dreading everything because I didn't have um, any sort of assurances. There was just no meaning to anything I was doing. I couldn't find purpose. I was grasping for it, but it was all just grasping at straws. And I didn't have any way to really ground that in something transcendent and eternal that was beyond just the machinations of my own making, my own mind.
Yeah, I probably know a little bit more about your story than you do mine, but we have very similar, very some of the events being different, but the themes that you touched on, I think it's the same for a lot of young people and young
Yeah.
men. But you come to see that it's ubiquitous in a lot of ways with the modern world. Um, I definitely wanted to talk and to unpack some ideas around mental health, and I know that you went through, periods of addiction and things like that, health issues, and that's a lot of the kind of the work that I'm doing here and what I do, in my full-time job around mental health. But how well can we go back into some of those parts, and can you elaborate a little bit on where those kinds of things, the mental health, the health issues, which I want to talk about more too, which I know you understand largely underlie for a lot of people mental health issues, and like uh either contribute or lie at the root, and
Yeah.
then the addictions that kind of they're all tied together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. There's a really fascinating quote that comes from, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but for maybe those in the audience, your listeners who maybe haven't heard it before, comes from an ancient philosopher that went by Hippocrates or Hippocrates, however you pronounce it. And that's where the Hippocratic oath comes from that doctors are supposed to swear by when they, get their degree or certification and all that. And it's hold on, I had it pulled up a second ago because I just was thinking about it. It was that all disease begins in the gut. And for someone that has dealt with myriad health problems, all of which seemed to be triggered by stomach problems, I found that to be like just mind blowing that here's this ancient dude that had this somehow figured out already thousands of years ago, so clearly there's some wisdom there. And it, for me, it definitely rang true. That was the really the beginning of all of the problems that I started having over the past 13, 14 years. Was, in a lot of ways, it's hard to describe. So I just say stomach problems as a really kind of umbrella term to encapsulate a number of different things that were going on. And they've always kind of seemed to evolve and progress in various different ways that has made it very tricky to keep up, so to speak. For every, new symptom that would manifest or new, issue that I'd be dealing with, I would figure out some kind of workaround eventually. And then it seemed like it would adapt to my solutions and new problems would come. And so it was just to my never ending frustration, trying to get ahead of this thing. And that's what a lot of the, angst came from. This anxiety really was mostly triggered by, I mean, there were physical sensations that were really terrifying, to be honest. And so that was a huge part of it. But another huge part was just the fact that this was such a mystery. Because of all the doctors that I would spend time, enumerating all of my symptoms to and going into as elaborate detail as I possibly could without just getting to the point that I was like, you know what, I've already said this, sang this same song a dozen times, I'm done. Each time I tried to be just as thorough, and they'd pretty much come to the same conclusions, all of them. They either their reflex is to want to prescribe you with something, and despite how many times I would try to emphasize the gut being the problem, they wanted to look at other things that I was describing symptomatically. I'd talk about how I would get heart palpitations or what, and so they'd be like, okay, let's do a let's do a what is it? Like a sonograph or an echo. I forget what the exact test is called, but
A
so
heart
it's something to look
test.
at the heart, like an X-ray of the heart, basically. And just, that was pretty much the theme. I went through MRIs. I went through this one lung test, basically, where you go and sit inside of this box kind of contraption, and you got to stay in there for like 5 or 10 minutes while it does what it's
Yeah.
doing. And it was wild, man. A lot of years of just kind of like seeing the doctors spinning their wheels. And, to their credit, and to the credit of all medical practitioners, I've tried to refrain from ever being someone that says like all doctors are just, it's just a scam. They're in it for the money. They just want to, slap you with a pharmaceutical so they can just, break in the cash. There are temptations at certain points in time to want to do that. And I understand that a lot of people probably do feel that way. And in some instances, they are justified. Unfortunately, a lot of the industry is, um, it's devolved to a certain degree, and it really becomes a matter of people trying to find the right doctor, people that have still are in it for the reason that we should be, right? To help people, to want to help find cures and heal people and give them better quality of life. And Lord knows they're out there, but it does feel like you got to really look sometimes to find those people that have the true motivations.
It seems like too. I mean, I have this little saying that I came up with that we don't have a healthcare system. We have a disease management and monetization system.
Right. Yeah,
And
because it's better to treat something rather than cure it because it's more profitable,
yeah,
right?
and it's not even the doctor's fault, you know, like I
Right.
totally agree with what you're saying. And like even when you do find a good doctor, which I think a lot of people probably get into it for the right reasons, and sure the money's tempting too, but even in that case, they're educated through such a pigeonholed lens of what health is and how humans work that even a good like mainstream doctor just doesn't have a lot of, you know, a lot of the info.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something I try to keep in mind is it's not even necessarily that it's not even always the case that like, oh, this guy is, he's been corrupted and he's no longer in it for the right reasons. A lot of the time it's, what you're saying. It's just there's certain presuppositions that they have and that, they've been trained to think a certain way, and it's not necessarily the appropriate approach for whatever someone's particular issue is. And because of, and, I don't want to get into the weeds of certain, quote unquote conspiracies that, maybe some people would be a little bit triggered by if I were just speaking a little more freely. But there are certain things that I feel about the pharmaceutical industry and the substances that we have put into our bodies, whether it's an injection or something you ingest orally, that it's just sort of assumed that, we, despite that there's not really any sort of long-term case studies for these things, we just assume that the effects are going to be XYZ, and that any adverse effects that may come up down the line, we assume, well, it couldn't be that, right? And so you've got doctors that are maybe
Yeah.
prescribing certain things, and it's either not helping or it's doing more harm than good.
And it appears to help sometimes because it just mutes what's happening, but it never
Exactly
actually
right.
fixes it. Yeah. I mean, I'm totally with you. Everything you're saying, same perspective and, you know, understanding of it. Especially around, maybe not especially, but specifically in this case, even looking at the pharmaceuticals through the lens of the mental health industry, like it's such a mess. It's such a mess. And you know, I think a lot of people are worse off for it, you know, like genuinely trying to get help and being led down
Yeah.
a path that the narrative is, you know, largely incomplete at best. But you know, I mean, it can be really
Mm-hmm.
life altering in a negative way for a lot of people. I mean, you know, myself as a young like teenager being one of them, but yeah, I'm with you. So you had gut issues going on. Can relate to that as well. Lots of
Yeah.
complications there, and you know, you come to connect, or I came to connect oftentimes when things like depressive symptoms or anxiety were flaring up. It was often when gut issues were flaring up as well, or at their worst points.
Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
yeah. So how did that progress for you? Like you know, you obviously were going to different doctors. You were attempting to take things into your own hands, which is also a common narrative I see, myself included, where like you find these different things that look like solutions. There's a lot of promise there, and maybe, you know, they help to some degree, but it's a very challenging, um, you know, it's a very challenging thing to fix gut dysbiosis and gut issues. So how did that progress for you, and
Yeah.
how did you know the lack of doctors' ability to really help? Where did that lead you?
Yeah. I'll mention one thing. There was a certain thing I was prescribed with years and years ago. It was, if I recall, it was called cephalexin.
Hmm.
And something that brought on was a lot of very dark thoughts. I am, you know, confident to say they were bordering on suicidal thoughts.
Hmm.
Not necessarily the tendency, but even the fact that I was entertaining certain thoughts because it was just um repressing, whatever thing it is in us that gives you some sense of hope or meaning. I don't know. It was fortunately very brief, and I'm talking like, you know, maybe a week or a week and a
Mm,
half before, my mom caught wind of how I was and was like,
yeah.
"This is done. This is done." So, um, fortunately that because that probably could have gotten worse, I imagine, had I continued. And so that, is just one example of sort of your confidence in the industry taking a hit, because it's like, well, here's something that was supposed to help, and it turns out you guys are really kind of just doing guesswork if you're prescribing something that can have such a negative effect that I'm literally not even wanting to be alive. Like, that's the exact opposite of what's supposed to be happening, right?
Yeah.
We're looking for better quality of life. And so, as time went on, you really end up just sort of taking it on yourself, and you do feel the weight of that burden on your own shoulders as you're trying to, as I said, really just feeling around in the dark, and you have no idea what you're doing. And um not I'm not trying to like toot my own horn here, but you really do be kind of become your own expert, right? You kind of master your own body and your own mind. um if you're lucky, if you have the strength to do that. I think that a lot of people, um it's hard, it really is. And there's no clear answer.
Mm,
And so what I ended up doing, and when I say lucky, I say that because I came out of this on the other side, but for a long time, I just kind of self-medicated. And that the way that that manifested was through, drinking for a lot of years, and then eventually getting into taking pills like opiates, like painkillers and oxys, all of that sort of thing. At which point I stopped drinking because those don't mix too well. Um, but that's not to my credit or anything, because had they mixed, I probably would have done both. Whatever made me feel a little more relaxed is the way that I generally justified that over the years. Was like, well, I owe this to myself because I'm constantly going through this struggle, both mentally and physically, which is taking an emotional toll, and unbeknownst to me at the time, a very huge spiritual toll, of course. And that is really just a fast track to rock bottom, man. I mean, to have to go that route because I felt like I was gonna die at some point, and I had no recourse. Like, might as well just feel good, might as well just try to numb some of this discomfort. Might as well try to lower my inhibitions that bring out this fear and anxiety. Whatever I can do to try to just make that go away. Just forget about it for a little while. Um, that's pretty much how I thought about it. And what you were saying earlier, you're right about. I think a lot of people are going through this same thing, and I think that's sort of a telltale sign. What is it that so many people all of the sudden in this generation are having this same problem? Like, there's obviously some kind of common denominator, something that was not present in the generation of our parents and our grandparents that suddenly now is. And fortunately, there are, things like social media that give people some sense of community and an ability to um, feel like there's some solidarity, in out there when you're dealing with these issues and you feel like you're all alone and it's just this big mystery and no one in your family relates, no one can understand, the doctors don't get it. It's very isolating.
yeah.
And so, you're like, well, the only way that I could think of to not feel just so much dread was like, well, I'm just gonna, keep that buzz going, because I hadn't really discovered these sort of groups like on Facebook or these forums that
Hmm.
you can find online where people will kind of pool resources and say, hey, here's things that have worked for me. Here's the information that I found out after years of digging, going through the exact same stuff. And fortunately, I've encountered some of that now, and it's definitely helped. I've tried a number of different approaches, like radical diet changes. I went gluten free on and off for years at a time. I gluten free for 3 years, and then had tests done. Doctor said, no, you're not, celiac. It's not that. So, but then of course my first reaction was like, well, I can drink beer again, and so I went straight back to drinking again. So it's been just scrambling, a lot of it, man. Just trying all kinds of different things. Some of them less healthy approaches than others, and eventually over time you sort of are able to build, if you're someone that's able to pay very close attention to your body and how you react to everything, and make a close mental note of that, like, oh, I ate this thing today, I feel like this, so I know it's that, because I haven't eaten that specific thing, I've avoided that drink or that food or that spice, whatever it is, and as soon as I tried it again, here comes that whatever it is.
Hmm.
So over time, I was able to build some kind of, you know, patchwork routine, just from trial and error.
What you just said is an exact mirror of my experience and still how I see it. And that's kind of what I meant earlier. It may not have been clear, but just how, you get into like the natural health world and like trying to heal yourself, and you come across all these different things that are, a parasite cleanse or colostrum or whatever the thing is that might help
Right.
with gut health, and like it's the thing, but then it's not the thing, like then it doesn't
Right.
work long term. And yeah, I mean it's kind of the, where I've got to, that for some people it does just have to be like a careful management of like learning, like this is where my body has gotten to, and like I just have to respect that. And some people don't understand it, like having to eat a certain way or like being particular about certain things. But I think even the people who may not be as deep into it as someone like you or me still have consequences to just eating whatever. They may just not point to the fact that they
Oh
have,
yeah.
no energy or they're depressed or whatever, because they attribute it to just, you know uh things that you can't do anything about, or genetics or chemical imbalances or whatever the case. But yeah,
Right.
totally, same story with me. Do you have any point where you can look back and see where like your gut issue started, or anything that you suspect might have been a major contributor?
Yeah. So the day that I have always looked back on and said to myself, that's where it started, would be, there was a day I believe this was around the time I had started community college, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and around that time, I hadn't gotten so much into a lot of different prescription things, but I was sort of experimenting with a few different ones, Adderall being one of them. And I remember I had tried that one particular week, and possibly I had tried Xanax. And this was during a phase where I was drinking and mixing certain things. Um, but anyway, so I was walking to a bus stop from a friend's one day, and I was walking up a hill. So there was a slight incline, and I had already been walking for about 35-40 minutes from where he lives to the bus stop. And I was used to doing that walk. It was I lived near the beach, so it was a nice, little stroll. I didn't mind. And as I was going up this hill, I started feeling a cramp a little bit on my right side. And for how little I was exerting myself, it was strange to be getting a cramp. I mean, I was going up a hill, but it's not even like I had just been chugging water or anything right before that, or doing anything that I should be getting a cramp right now. And so it started getting worse. I was like, what is this? What's going on? What's the deal with this? And I remember lifting up my shirt and looking down at my stomach because it was getting kind of bad. And as I did that, I'm looking down. I remember seeing my entire abdomen just puffed out
Hmm.
all of a sudden. It was like a rapid onset bloating kind of situation. It was bizarre. Um, and for whatever reason, in that moment, um, when I watched that happen, what it brought to mind for me was this story that my mother had told me years before that about some guy that had like I don't even know what the story was exactly. It was either his kidney ruptured or um, something with an internal organ. Maybe it was his pancreas or
Hmm.
something that had gone wrong, and because he was not brought to the hospital quick enough, basically the guy died. And so when I saw this, that was the first thing that came to mind for me. And so in that moment was the first time I started to experience, a sort of form of anxiety that I had never had before,
Hmm.
because I'm thinking about, like, am I about to die? Did I just watch like my internal organs just ruptured or something weird? I had no idea what was going on. And so sort of panicking, trying to call family up. And there's a part of me that's sort of telling them like I'm trying to give them, last goodbyes, like telling them I love you guys and all this
Hmm.
stuff, because I'm sort of worrying, like, what was that? What did I just see? That was like, I'd never experienced anything like that, or seen that before. So anyway, that's what I see as sort of being where it all began. I had had certain things growing up that I still experience now that did predate then that day. Um, so, there's a part of me that's like, was this something that was sort of dormant, and to certain unhealthy triggers sort of contributed to, making it something that's more active, or it was, I don't know. I can't tell if it was inevitably going to manifest in my life in some way or not, because, there's just there's so many underlying factors that could possibly contributed to just so many, especially living where we live in the States, so many unhealthy, parts of our lifestyles and of our diets that just wreak havoc, on the gut lining, and that's directly tied in with you know the mental state. So
Are you familiar with Natasha Campbell McBride, the GAPS lady, or GAPS doctor?
yes, I remember. I would not have remembered the name, but when you said gaps, I do remember that. I remember listening to a sort of lecture or something, a presentation she was giving um, on stage. I think it was maybe in 2019 when somebody sent me a link to that, and I had listened to it. Yeah.
Yeah, the reason I bring it up is because one of the things, I mean, she's real big into to gut health and psychology and the connection, but one of the things that she talks about is for a lot of people, the only manifestation of gut issues might be psychological symptoms or like things that one might not perceive as stomach issues. And then oftentimes there's like that breaking point where it becomes obvious that something's going on in my gut that's probably been off for a very long time. But I mean, I think it's a good
Hmm.
just to insert for people to relate to. I mean, I think a lot of people are more familiar with the idea that like gut health and mental health are not only like interconnected, they're like almost mirrors of each other.
Right.
Um, but with what you're saying with our unhealthy lifestyles, like if I'm sure you can put yourself into this. Like, this is exactly my story. But if somebody grew up where they were given antibiotics liberally, which most of us are, without properly replenishing probiotics, eat junk food, take over the counter meds, Tylenols, things like that, alcohol, any types of drugs, excess stress, even like sitting for long periods of time in school and how that affects like different musculature around our stomach and
Right.
those organs and all. Like, take one person or find one person that doesn't have that same story, and with all those, if somebody does have some sort of predisposition at all to anything related to mental health, like, there are the underlying kinds of causes or the triggers. And like you said, I think that there's a lot of people that have all this stuff for a while, and it's not until later, maybe even never, like, experiencing the direct GI types of stuff. But I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a big part of it for so many people. And I think it's, in addition, I've really come to, are you familiar with Jonathan Pageau?
Say it again.
Are you familiar with Jonathan Pageau?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, one of the big things for me, and by the way, if at any point it seems like I'm interrupting, we might have a slight delay, but um, something that was really powerful for me to just kind of learn as a concept was the idea of matter and meaning. So we're like just both the physical and the
Yeah.
spiritual. And at this point, anybody, and again, I'm speaking specifically around like mental health stuff, but anybody that's not approaching them from a matter and a meaning standpoint is just missing like a huge part of
Yes.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's
So
definitely I
go
was just
ahead.
going to say there's definitely a lot of details that you really, like I was saying earlier, you really have to be paying attention and in tune with your own body and the sort of cause and effect relationships between things that, like you're saying, you could very easily go years or your entire lifetime without noticing. You could miss it if you're not um, recognizing there are connections between things, and those are sometimes, they're imperceptible because it could be, you're referencing Pajot is very into symbolism and these sort of more abstract ways of drawing connections, and I think that's definitely something that's important for people to try to cultivate and know, how to do, even just like at a baseline level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's go into self-denial. And for anybody, I'll link your testimonial / documentary in the show notes. For anybody who's not familiar or who hasn't watched it, you have a great testimonial video on YouTube called is it called The Path of Self-Denial? Is that the title?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think it's such an important idea and concept and understanding nowadays. And it's something that even before Orthodoxy, like for myself coming there, I had started to find a little bit in places like Stoicism,
Mm-hmm.
in a slightly different way, but similar nonetheless, and something that hits you in a place that feels very true in a world that we live such the opposite. There's something very like grounding about it, very freeing. Um, I have a couple of things that I wanted to ask you about this, but just in terms of self-denial, like, how might you present that to somebody who's unfamiliar with it, and why is it something that that especially like a man in the modern world, a young man like us, may find value in?
Yeah, sure. So the way that I generally frame it is this principle comes from a specific passage or passages in scripture in the Bible, um, that where Christ is saying anyone that wants to follow him, they're going to have to deny themselves and take up their cross and follow him. And so the way that cashes out in everyday sense in the way of living, and the way that I look at it is that all of the world's problems stem from our failure to deny ourselves. Because like you're just saying, we live in a, society that very much embraces the opposite. We're actually taught to love yourself. And in one sense, in a specific context, I wouldn't disagree. I understand what they mean, as a means of, not giving ourselves over to sort of self-deprecating thoughts and succumbing to depression and self-loathing and all of that. Like, yes, learn to love yourself in the sense that you are a valuable soul made in the image of God. Like, okay, I can get behind that 100%. But when we look at our society and the extreme lengths that it has gone to in its very hedonistic, self-indulgent, self-obsessed tendencies, I think it's safe to say that the self-love in the former sense is a little bit, not so much what is being intended to be conveyed so much as the latter sense. Like, people have taken love yourself, and I mean, I can't, think of a single female these days who doesn't have an Instagram feed loaded with selfies, right? It's all look at me. Everything is centered around the self. And so this principle of self-denial is really what's going to take us out of the center and put God back in the center where he belongs. And that's something I immediately grasped in coming to the faith, was that God is not like this thing. When they say, "Oh, accept Christ into your life," that's not to say that you just tack him on as this like additional thing you have now. I now believe. No, everything else is now either secondary or it's just gone. You just wipe the slate clean, and God is the first and only thing, and then everything else comes after that, right? That's the sort of way that the uh, priority list should be established. And so when we think about how that works in terms of being told to deny ourselves, um, everything that estranges us from God and that removes him from the center is a result of self-denial. When we overindulge in certain, whether it's food or drink, or it could be overindulging in like, watching too much TV or spending too much time staring at your phone, scrolling around mindlessly. These are all things that are distractions and that we make into idols in our lives, and they rob our focus from where it should be. And all sorts of problems naturally follow when we start falling into these pitfalls, these bad habits. It can manifest in small ways or ways that seem small at first, and they sort of snowball into bigger problems, like not paying as much attention to your spouse and giving attention to your children in the way that we ought to, because I'm trying to watch the game, or I'm trying to play this video game, or I'm whatever, doing something on Facebook or whatever it is. Rather than saying, I'm not going to do the thing I want to do the most. I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to deny myself, and I'm going to give attention elsewhere. Um, One thing I mentioned in the testimony is this is the way that all conflict arises, is a failure of self-denial. So if I get into an argument with my wife, it's because my opinion, my perspective is what I'm putting first, right? I'm not putting myself in her shoes, even if she's in the wrong, and even if all all you have to do really is not want to force your perspective onto the other person, not need to be proven right, not need them to know that you're right and concede your point, right? If you would just humble yourself, walk it back a little bit and just say, okay, she misunderstood something, or she forgot this one thing. And even though I'm the one that's being blamed or accused, I'll just say, that's fine. I'll just do the thing, even though I already did it, or even though, whatever it is. And same thing when it comes to larger scale conflicts like wars or, whatever, then you've got, political heads and governments that are failing to deny themselves because they are, greedy for more resources or economic standing or land or whatever. And so it just goes to show that when we do not deny ourselves, it causes problems. There is a natural tension that comes about when we resist that principle. And when we embrace it, everything naturally flows smoother, both in your personal life, in and on a societal scale, you know. So yeah, that's pretty much how I would break it down. I mean, we could go into more detail and nuance, but in the broadest terms, I would say that that's how I try and frame that.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting thing. You mentioned it at the beginning of what you just said, that we have this huge push in our culture for like self-care and self-love. And like you said, there's some truth there. Like there's a lot of people who, because of a lack of understanding of how to keep up with themselves, like that spills over and hurts other people. Or you know what I mean? Like there is a certain amount of keeping our own cup full so that we have something to pour out that's true. But without this kind of perspective, that seems to be going and being taken to like this very, you know, deeply narcissistic, self-centered kind of thing, which I mean, like at a point in time, I got caught up into. And again, there was like useful things there, and some of it I needed to be doing and learning. Um, but there's definitely like there's some overlap with this, and then there's some complete, opposite in terms of these two different paths. But how might you find like the middle ground between, the self-denial and also just understanding that like we are people and we do have needs. And one of the problems in the world too is that a lot of people don't understand how to meet their own needs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as cliche as it sounds, I would say just the simple, you know, it's moderation. It comes down to like, I mentioned overindulgence in food. So it's not like food itself is inherently wrong or sinful or anything like that. But when we make that into something that is a primary focus, and oh, my whole day is crap now that I didn't get the exact coffee I wanted, or, I didn't get to go to that, whatever it is, a restaurant, it's, we don't want the things of the world to be what give us such gratification, to the extent that if we don't have those things, that is then going to impact my inner peace in some way, right?
Hmm.
And then there's as a, add on to that point about moderation, I would say that you also have to, and I of course say this from the perspective of a Christian, you have to have moral grounding, because there are things that, from my perspective, you can't necessarily moderate. And then it's just like, well, at least I'm not murdering too many people. At least I'm not engaging in too much pornography, or in all these things that are very, very much focused on a, a release of the self, whether it's I'm trying to release anger in a way that is
Hmm.
violent, or I'm trying to release the passions, as we say in Orthodoxy, right? Putting the passions in check is something that there isn't, there's grace from God when we fail, of course, but if we are giving ourselves over into, wanton, flagrant disregard of what we know is moral, then moderation is not going to serve you at any point, when you get to that point. So yeah, I would just keep it simple like that. You have to have some sense of moral grounding, which from my perspective necessitates God and the church. Like you need those as a part of your spiritual formation. That's not to say that we can't know what's right and wrong without those, because God has impressed these things on the conscience. But I mean, when you divorce yourself, and you just, you divorce yourself from God, and you have this sort of loose or ambiguous sense of some vague belief in a higher power, then look at the way that sort of cashes out in society. You know, you've got plenty of people that give lip service to belief in a higher power or God, and yet their lives are a mess still. They're still, knee deep in addiction. And, but that was me for years. You know, I had some sense of belief, but it wasn't doing me any good, So there's got to be some solid foundation. And that is really, as far as I'm concerned, um, it's the only way to not be taking like a half measure.
Yeah. I mean, that all makes a lot of sense, and something that I thought about, it came up during both of the last two things that you said, was that it seems like there's a certain middle point between self-denial and, to use, I know this is more of like a stoic term, but it's definitely there in Christianity, but like living in accordance with God's creation, let's say, like eating,
Yeah.
eating the food that God put on the earth and intended us to eat, getting enough sleep. And there's a part of self-denial in that this is kind of a new thing that I'm thinking about, so it might feel a little sloppy how it comes out, but if I'm eating real food that is healthful and gives me energy, rather than the thing that, sure, it tastes super good, but it gives me a headache and now I have no energy to play with my kid or do the things that my wife needs me to do, like denying that part of me,
Mm.
that lower part of me, like the passion part of me that wants that upfront pleasure, there's a denial. If I am exhausted because I'm staying up watching TV or playing video games rather than getting sleep because my body is telling me that as part of the way God designed me that I need it, and then I wake up exhausted and can't do the things I need to do, that is like, so I think that
Right.
there's a middle ground between, and I know in your documentary, I was like, happy to hear you say, and this is a topic that's interesting to me in relation to, orthodoxy too, but just like kind of reconnecting to some of these things that, number one, in our modern world was lost, but maybe in some of the history, or like the most obvious history of Christianity, like didn't have a whole lot of like, it's there, I see it in some of the earlier saints and stuff, but didn't have a whole lot of emphasis on like taking care of your body. And again, it is there, it's definitely there. I mean, I have a whole page of quotes from, Saint Basil and like Saint Nectarios, who's more recent saint, but
Yeah.
but like that self-denial merges a little bit with self-discipline, merges with kind of learning how God designed us to live. And I like to, like, I have this idea of six, like the foundation of physiological foundation of health and healing. So just physiological, I'm not limiting to, these only, but like getting enough time outside, getting enough sleep, eating well, staying hydrated, moving enough, and understanding how to breathe properly. Like all those things synergize and are like just part of understanding our basic biology, and don't need to get into anything, like crazy or self-obsessive. But it's kind of like when we just understand where those fall in, and like the place that they should, the role that they should play in our lives, like those are the things where they seem dull, they don't seem as exciting as playing video games or eating junk food or,
Right.
drinking or whatever, but they fill a certain need that I think we all have biologically, that like can almost turn down our need for like all this excess stimulus, because our needs are just being met in that way. And like
Mm-hmm.
from that place, it feels like then I can be like, well, now I can put all of you first, because on the regular, I'm filling up my cup just with this basic, these basic components of like how humans are meant to live in relation to, like God's creation, let's say. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I don't know how many of your listeners may or may not be Christians or specifically Orthodox, but in the Orthodox tradition, we have fasting is a regular part of Orthodox life. I mean, every week and throughout the year. Um, so uh, we're not Gnostics, right? We don't think that the created things are bad in and of themselves, which is why we do have feast days. We feast
Mm-hmm.
and we enjoy the things like that you were saying, the fruit that God has given us from the earth, these are good. Um, and they're for our nourishment and for our benefit. But we have as a practice fasting. And, I think one of the reasons maybe that we don't see a ton of this in the literature of the early church, like you were saying, is because fasting was such a regular part of life. And I think that really plays a big role in health, as we see in scripture in Daniel. There's the point where they're all captured, and there's food that's being basically that's been sacrificed to idols that's being offered, and so they say, no, I'm going to eat just vegetables for however long it was, for like a week or 10 days or something like that. And next thing you know, these the pagans are looking at it, and they're like, how are these guys more healthy than our servants, and our what's going on here? So like there's clearly some principle there, right, that they knew real early on, even prior to the establishment of the church. And so this was really just being carried on in the life of the church.
Hmm.
And I imagine all of the early saints, they had a perfect understanding of this. Like, yes, we eat in moderation, we don't just engorge ourselves. And that has to do with temperance and moderation. And also, one thing I like to really point out is that as far as who is in control goes, people maybe would cite um, eating whatever, a whole platter of, from some buffet somewhere where it's all just a bunch of greasy fried food. And maybe they'd say, like, this is my freedom. I'm free to do so. Like, this is what makes me feel like I'm in control, because this is what I want, and I'm able to do the things that I want. And I would say actually the exact inverse is true, that it is the ability to resist doing exactly what you want that really demonstrates
Hmm.
having freedom, because you are not controlled by your impulses. The ability to keep those in check and to resist doing that, even though I want to do it, that's actually exhibiting that even higher standard of freedom, right? That I'm making a conscious decision. I'm using the force of my will to govern my actions, not just these baser impulses that I act on whenever I get them, right? So I think it's a really beautiful thing that the Orthodox Church so cultivates, fasting as just literally a way of life, right? I mean, this is just such an integral part of the lives of Orthodox Christians. I think it's some like 200 some odd days out of the years we're fasting, right? And so, this principle of self denial is something that I had held and cherished as my favorite thing in all of Scripture before I came into the church. And now, having been received into the church and seeing that literally this core part of the structure of the church in fasting literally is like, that's the teaching. It's
Hmm.
denying yourself. That's exactly what it is, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it is really, I mean, it's there's something um well, let me ask you this. Do you have a hard stop at 11 or 11 my time?
No, no. Yeah, we're
Okay.
good.
Okay. Um that's something that I think would be worth touching on too, is like, let me see if there's anything else. Self-denial. Well, let's put that. I mean, you can bring that thread in if you want, but let's say you had your toes dipped in like new age kinds of stuff for a period of time, as did I.
Yeah.
Um, and I I'm compassionate when I look back at myself in that place and the people that are. I think there's a lot of like hate that goes into that, or the wrong word to use, but just kind of like looking at it as something like, people can't understand how people wind up there. But
Yeah.
I actually think maybe you'd agree that I mean, you see a lot of people coming into Orthodoxy from there, from kind of the New Age types
Mm-hmm.
of stuff. And I think the reason why, like I'm sure there's many, but is because number one, when people get into that, it breaks their materialist worldview. Like they start to believe, like, oh, like there's something bigger than just what I see with my two eyes. It's number one. And then number
Yeah.
two, it opens people up for an honest desire for the truth. And seeing that both of these things are so absent in the culture, it becomes like a counterculture and it becomes a way of, like it brings real life because both of those things are true. Both of those things are real truths. But I see that when people follow that path long enough, those two things within the new age, like most people, a lot of people are winding up at orthodoxy. And I think it's going to continue to happen, because it breaks down the barriers that maybe a Western person would have had being,
Right.
mainly just exposed at best to Western Christianity. So it sort of reorients, reopens to those things, and then you come to Orthodoxy and realize like I mean, it has everything that Western Christianity has, so to speak, but it's so much different than that. But
Yeah.
and it's kind of like the New Age is responding to something that's missing in Western Christianity, and by New Age, because it's such a big term, I mean, like the pick and choose and the more spiritual kinds of practices and like
Mm-hmm.
the participatory aspect to living a spiritual life, not just saying things and not just intellectualizing things. But so how might you take that and like, I'm sure that a lot of people who listen to this may not be Orthodox or may not be yet. How might you, in a compassionate way, look at somebody who's where you were in like the New Age ideology and just offer a thread as to why Orthodoxy in particular? And the reason that this came up after what you just said was kind of the practices and the order that's in Orthodoxy that I think is so needed in a world where, going all the way back to the beginning of the podcast when you were saying like you never really had any concrete like structure to understand reality or like a real worldview. That's a lot that I just put in there. But somebody who's kind of in the new age or coming out of that, like why orthodoxy?
Yeah, sure. I sympathize with, people that are in the new age, having been there myself. And, that's because we are and man is inherently religious, inherently spiritual. Like the soul of man naturally wants to gravitate towards his maker. And because we don't always know how to do that, sometimes we just end up somewhere. And when you put it together yourself, then that often looks like the new age. And something you said earlier towards the beginning about how your story has so many common elements with my own. I can't tell you how many times I have heard that, and especially just recently in reading through the comments of the testimony and seeing how many people have said that and reaching out on Messenger and just saying like, wow, our stories are the same. And I think that's because you know there's a you're saying how we're sort of grasping at the truth. And so people that keep that as their motivator, they're going to naturally come to a lot of the same conclusions. People that are the specific breed that is willing and humble enough to embrace something even if it's contrary to what they thought was true, even if it contradicts everything I believed to be the case beforehand. That was me. And so you've got a lot of people that are in that same boat, especially nowadays. The lies and corruption in the world have become so pervasive. It's really getting hard for people to miss at this point. So people are naturally just sort of starting to come online by nature of what the enemy is doing. And they're like, well, okay, hold on. Like, I do have a brain in my head, like I can see clearly these things are not adding up. And so it's sort of ironic in one sense that because of the increase in evil in the world, people are naturally starting to recognize these spiritual elements that lead them towards God. And so because people get woken up and they start looking and digging for the truth and wanting to know the truth is what's motivating them, a lot of us naturally start ending up coming to all the same conclusions in many different categories. So, with respect to the New Age, that would be the category that recognizes, okay, there's something going on in this realm of reality that we're inhabiting that transcends just this physical body, this physical matter in front of me. I've clearly noticed that there is some kind of divine communication going on. I've recognized these completely inexplicable patterns and coincidences that absolutely defy logic if we're trying to just look at it from a purely naturalistic standpoint. It does not make any sense. It's like it defies all possibility that these things would happen by chance alone. And so that naturally draws people into the New Age. I would say specifically because, as scripture says, man in his natural state is in rebellion against God, the true God, right? And so because people aren't necessarily, I won't speak for everyone, but I'll speak for myself, not necessarily ready to embrace the traditional archetype that we find throughout history as given in the Orthodox Church, right? The what people love to say these days, what the patriarchy, right? That's sort of the undertone that I think a lot of people perceive, that Christianity is like this sort of oppressive, superstitious, outdated system that works according to all of these old, outmoded beliefs based on the patriarchy. And they're just doing this for control or whatever your preconceived notions are. I shared many of them. That's why I know. And so you naturally will gravitate towards something that's a little bit more relaxed, spiritually speaking, doctrinally speaking. I can sort of piece together this framework that works for me and then say that I'm spiritual, but not necessarily religious. I don't abide by any man-made organization. There's like, I could just list down all of these different sort of slogans or catchphrases that people have adopted. And I think in a lot of cases, without realizing this is something they've really heard somewhere else. It's not necessarily an issue they've thought through themselves in depth. They heard someone say it, it sort of reaffirmed or reinforced some underlying thought they had had before. And because of that natural rebellion against God, they went, yeah, that's true. They are oppressive. They are out, whatever. They're bigoted. It's just a bunch of bigots they're just ignorant. They don't know. The true spirituality is over here. It's about ascending to your higher self and your higher consciousness, and everything is this idea of frequency and vibration and trying to transcend in some way that I don't think anyone really has a firm grip on what that means exactly, which is why you've got so many different schools of thought under the New Age, right? That's really an umbrella term, that there's a whole lot of stuff under there. And so that's why you've got a lot of people that sort of just piece something together and take a lot of different elements from various schools of thought in Eastern mysticism, piece it together, find one that works for them and that reaffirms their own way of thinking. And they just will sort of run with that. And that could be something that develops over time. They maybe will tack on more things or get rid of a few things. For people that are unfamiliar, that are listening, I would highly recommend an author and someone that we highly venerate in the Orthodox Church, who's called Father Seraphim Rose. And there's one book in particular called Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future that for me was very eye-opening. I'm not sure if you've read it or not, but
Yeah.
I mean, that was like wild to see this man, in the 60s, 70s, like, I'm not exaggerating when I say literally prophetically saying what's going to be happening. I'm assuming in part because he was recognizing certain things in his own time. But I mean, the degree to which we're seeing it now, all of the things he said have like increased exponentially. And a lot of the reason I bring it up is because a lot of what he covers in the book deals with this issue in particular, this sort of Eastern mysticism and this blending together of different religious ideas and marrying them into sort of one unified system that does not necessarily have truth as its central tenet. And it's more about what a lot of us are hearing right now currently. It's a lot of it about is about inclusivity, right? This sort of perennialist idea that all religions have a little bit of the truth. We're all really worshiping the same God. It's all really many paths towards heaven, and this sort of idea. And as Orthodox, we would respond to that saying, we understand what the intention is and wanting people to find that spiritual comfort that they so desperately desire and need, but we would not agree or affirm that that is the right way to go about it. And just as one very easy and quick way to be able to put that in check and dismiss that idea is the notion that two contradictory statements can't both be true at the same time, right? So you've got a handful of religions in the world, Orthodoxy, Islam, Judaism, just to name a few of the big ones, um, that make mutually exclusive claims. And so it doesn't matter if any one of these, or Hindus or Buddhists or whoever, have elements of truth. I don't think there's any Orthodox Christian that would deny that there are elements of truth. Even atheists have elements of truth, but that isn't the point. The point is the fullness of truth, and more importantly, the foundation of truth. If what we're saying at a very foundational level is true, and someone in another system with a different foundational truth is making a different claim or a conflicting claim, and they both can't be true at once, then it is not possible to marry all of these things together in some sort of misguided attempt to say that everyone really has a little bit of it. Like, well, yeah, sure, but that isn't the ultimate point, though, right? So I understand where people are coming from and what they're trying to achieve and what they think they're doing, but it's not actually going the route that they think it is. And that would be my main criticism with respect to the new age, is that it's just this broad and ambiguous sort of field where you're really, just like I said earlier, you're grasping at straws. There is nothing concrete there. And in a lot of cases, it actually will transgress into the realm of the demonic. And because you don't have a proper foundation there, you won't even realize that you're playing with fire, much like a child holding a stick of dynamite that is tantalized by the sparkling light because he doesn't understand what he's holding in his hand, right? And he would argue with his parents, like, no, look, no, look how pretty this is. Like, really, it really is pretty. But it's like, that's not the point. I understand there are real rewards in these sort of spiritual dabblings in the new age, but the real reward that is the flickering light, you're not recognizing what you're really holding in your hand, is really how I would break that down ultimately in the end.
Yeah, great. It's, I mean, a lot of interesting stuff in there, and that your analogy, I forget who said this, but maybe you know, but the kind of the idea that a lot of what people are finding in the new age is like the false light of the self, which is there and it is intoxicating and it is bright, but it's not meant to be stopped at. It's meant to be like gone through to God.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens and what we're finding, because there is, I mean, maybe you would say the same thing. Like there is something to be found there. There's something that, like, when I was at that point in my journey, like I had thought I had found something very light, and it's easy for me to see now and obvious that it was like the light of my own self, kind of, I don't know the best way to word it, but sort of it becomes like a worshiping your own higher self kind of thing rather than worshiping God. And again, for somebody who's like coming out of a very mundane, materialistic, reductionistic way of living and seeing the world, like that's intoxicating for sure. And like it can be hard to escape, but just like you said, it's the sparkle is there, but you don't really realize what you're doing with it and where it can lead. And you do see a lot of people, just that leads down to a very, dark path. And it's not always,
Yeah.
sometimes it's subtle too. Sometimes the darkness is subtle. When I look back at
Mm-hmm.
my own journey, like the darkest points were subtle. They were even things that that at that point in time, I could interpret as being light, as being something good.
Yeah.
But when I look back now, I see that some of the most dark things were some of the subtly the things that I thought were light, that
Right.
it's no longer deceiving in that way.
That's because, I mean, there's, to be clear, there are different degrees of entertaining the demonic. Like a lot of people liken it to opening a doorway, right? And so what you would be describing right now is like the door is just ajar a little bit. And so there's not like your life's just rampant with all of this kind of demonic activity and you're being attacked spiritually. That can happen. But I mean, like playing around with crystals and stuff is not going to be the same thing as like holding a, seance or some kind of
Yeah,
ritual sacrifice. You know what I mean? Like there's definitely way different levels. So this is why we clarified this is an umbrella term, the new age.
right.
It's not like it's all one thing. And, just one of the things that's really dangerous is what you're talking about, this sort of self worship, because a lot of those different schools do teach that we are basically ascending to godhood, right? We are man, his whole purpose is to attain to divinity. And it's in a very different context than what we teach in Orthodoxy, which is that we are deified through the grace of God, right? Not by our own will and our own to use terms that they use, like you manifest your destiny and things to that effect, right? Like you just use your own mental willpower to sort of bend reality to your will, but rather recognizing that the salvation of man does not come from himself, because um, I mean, it to use a sort of just simple analogy, it'd be like expecting a drowning man to rescue himself from drowning, right? You're in the middle of the ocean, there's no one around you, and you're just going, I'll just stop drowning. Like, what? How does that work, right? You need an outside party to come in and out of the kindness of their own heart. This is who God would be. He's the one that condescended from his realm in the heavenly realm down to us. This is what makes Christianity so unique. It's the one religion that teaches we do not work our way up to God. He is the one that comes down
Hmm.
to our level and scoops us up out of the filth and the mess that we have made of our lives. And he brings us to where he is. And it's just, I mean, it's such a beautiful truth to embrace. And it's such a, as the scriptures say, my burden is light, right? Like it's such a burden off of our own shoulders to know that salvation doesn't come through me, that I don't have to be like this. I mean, we are called to still, put in effort and try to become holy, which from where I am now sounds like a tall order. Trying to compare myself with like the saints, I'm like, I can't even conceive of how this is possible. But um, it's a process that, God works with us and through us. And so if you think that you're going to attain to godhood all on your own, and you're going to do it by some kind of means that God himself has not prescribed, then you're, to put it politely, you are in delusion. Like there's no way to say that more nice than that. I'm sorry, and I do sympathize with those that are in the new age, because I know you are hungry for true spiritual food. You're seeking, and I respect that. That's what um, so many of us go through as we're trying to find the truth. But at the end of the day, the truth does not come through us alone. We are not the medium by which that happens.
Awesome. Let's have one more specific question and then some quick fire, if that works.
Yeah, sure, man.
So I want to ask this because I think that one of the barriers for a lot of people, myself included, going back for something like orthodoxy is the organizational aspect to it, the structure of it,
Yeah.
which, I mean, to me at this point is like one of the most important aspects.
Yeah.
um, but I understand why a lot of people are put off by that, and that's one of the things that, in terms of the new age, is almost, I mean, it may be the exact opposite end of the spectrum. Although, just to throw in there, because I think that they're not as far as people think, that if you put a spectrum on a circular kind of thing, the further apart 2 points get, really the closer they get. And I think that a lot of the people who are in this, like, do whatever you want, it's your will, all this stuff, are like actually pretty close to wanting to just step in and let go of all that, have the structure and whatnot. But that's sort of a side point. But for orthodoxy, and in terms of, let's say, the world that we live in, the modern world, the culture that we have, and how conducive that is to depression and anxiety and leading toward addiction and meaninglessness and hopelessness and purposelessness, what does orthodoxy as an organization offer, in your opinion, that provides a solution to what our culture is missing, that tends to lead people increasingly to these states?
Yeah. Unity in our beliefs and practices was one thing that really drew me in. One really common objection that I used to make, and that we still hear people make, is about how God is not in a building, right? It's not about the structure or the organization. And one thing that I used to tell a certain family member of mine when they'd make that argument was, when you've got a lot of people using football, for example, or the Super Bowl, you've got a lot of people that really love one thing. And so, which do people generally find to be more fun, to watch at home by themselves, or to go to somebody else's house where 10 or 20 of their friends are going to be, to watch it together, where there's energy and people, are shouting and jumping up and down when they're watching the game, or to the even greater degree, to go to the actual game itself and be there with a whole stadium full of people that are cheering or booing or whatever. The energy is just totally different. So that's not to say you can't watch by yourself, but they aren't the same thing. And I would apply that same principle as far as worship goes. When you have people that all believe the same things as you, and they all want to share the same relationship with the same God, why would you not want to go to where they're all gathering together to worship? the energy is going to be exponentially higher than what you can achieve on your own. There's a difference between one person singing psalms to God versus a choir of voices that can achieve harmonies you cannot possibly achieve by yourself. So that's one way to look at it. In addition to that, the things that the church offers in terms of the sacraments in Orthodoxy, we believe to have real energetic properties that are in service of our salvation in terms of, divine, a divine presence, which is something that from the Western, more scholastic approach to Christianity, like Protestants, would tend to come with a more intellectualized desire to want to rationalize these things. And in Orthodoxy, we see these as more being mystical. And that's something that people in the New Age and who are accustomed to, Eastern mysticism would actually appreciate and be more accustomed to maybe, embracing these sorts of ideas, because we don't feel the need to explain everything in a strictly rational, scholastic sense in Orthodoxy. We are content to just say, okay, we believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, that's Holy Communion. And that's to say that at some point during the divine service, that the bread and the wine become, or rather, are indwelled with the presence of the body and blood. We don't claim to know how that works, but we believe it. And that's okay for us. And this is something that is regenerative to the soul of man in some way. How that works, we just say that we are participating in the divine. We are partaking, and in a very real way. It's not just something that is symbolic. So these are things that I'm very keen on, our kids being baptized young, as is customary to do. But you see a lot of inquirers coming into the church that are eager to get, their kids baptized, because it's important for their spiritual formation to be participating in the sacraments as early as possible. So yeah, I mean, the solidarity aspect and having unity with people that share all of your ideas, the sacraments, these are things that, we, just to name a few, that we have to offer in the church that the rest of the world is, it's not going to be giving you. And in terms of why it's important to have these sorts of, like you were saying, these visible boundaries of where the church is for people that maybe are still a little bit uncomfortable with the idea, is to just, if I could break it down as quick as possible in terms of the historic way that this has panned out, is you have Christ that came and was incarnate in the world. He taught the apostles certain things that we are not physically present to have heard him say and teach. And so he instructed them for years in the way that they should be thinking, the way that they should be feeling, and how their hearts should be towards their fellow man. And, things that pertained to himself, the kingdom, and to the church. And so he bestowed authority upon them. And in like turn, they then bestowed their authority to their next generation of disciples, and so forth up until today. And this is what we believe in the Orthodox Church, in this principle called apostolic succession. And without that, you could have anyone pick up their Bible, read it, and based on their own interpretation of what it says, come up with all kinds of ideas that are contrary to the things that Christ actually taught. And this is exactly what's happened throughout history, as what we call heresy has continually emerged, which is to say that people that come in with false teachings or false doctrines that sound true or sound good, and usually come from someone that is well-meaning, maybe even, and has a lot of right things to say, but it ultimately misses the mark and leads us off into wrong directions, into all kinds of errors and mistakes, and not the truth. And so that's what makes having the visible boundaries so important, is that we know where the canonical where the boundaries are. This is where it stops. The things that are outside of these boundaries are where error and lies are, and in here is where we know the truth is.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to articulate all that you did, but I agree in my limited experience with what you said. And I think that even placing special emphasis on your first point of the community aspect and like holding common beliefs, something that's like such an amazing thing, and it's so hard to find in this world, where really, like, for all people, the highest possible thing is unifying everything else, rather than, like, maybe you can go find a book club or like Weston A. Price or some sort of something that like people have something in common, which I think we all, especially in this world, want. But um there's something, especially for like our emotional, our mental, our spiritual, our physical health, about having community, having the gathering, like you said, listening to the chanting, which is I mean, you don't even need anything scientific to understand that it has just a healing effect, but there is
Yeah,
science there to show that as well. But if you go and experience that, like, you don't need to think about it, in your heart and your body, and then the cells of your body, that like something about being part of that is just like it's what I'm designed to do and be a part of.
absolutely. Yeah, it definitely speaks to your soul. And I would
Yeah.
highly recommend people just, if they are unfamiliar, to at least just visit a divine liturgy at an Eastern Orthodox church and see for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. All right, so let's I have four rapid fire questions.
Yeah, go for it, man.
What is if more than one, that's fine. What's your favorite passage in the Bible? Something that speaks to you and gives you, strength.
Apart from the one about self-denial, that would definitely be my main one.
Why don't you reiterate it in full? That line.
Yeah, sure. It's Matthew 16:24. Depending on which translation you're looking at, the wording might be a little different, but it's basically, if anyone would come after me, which is if anyone wants to follow me or be my disciple, you must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. And something we didn't talk about earlier about the take up your cross bit is to do with, everyone in this life has some cross that they bear. That's your struggles. For me, it's this health stuff, the gut problems, among other things. But there's always some cross that we bear. And doing that in gladness and persevering through it humbly is all a part of what it means to follow Christ.
And falls very much in the umbrella of self-denial, right?
Yes,
Like that's kind
exactly.
of a, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, you were gonna, I think you had another one in addition to that passage.
Um, Off the top of my head, I think the one that just came to me right now, I believe it comes from Hosea, and I could be wrong on that, so don't quote me. But it's and I'm just paraphrasing. It's basically, and I believe it's reiterated in the Gospels by one of the apostles, saying that in those days I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and there's more to it, but that's all I remember off the top of my head. And that's basically what I see happening right now. I
Mm.
feel in this generation of what we call quote unquote truthers. So many people waking up and escaping the matrix, as it were. I believe that that's really what we're witnessing. We're seeing God in his great mercy as we approach the last days, pouring out his spirit in such a way that people are becoming more discerning. They're seeing things for what they really are. And it's really what's going to be, what people need to. I mean, if God does not reveal himself we could conceivably not even know that he exists, you know? And yet you've got even people that are not Christians or maybe even atheists. There is something in man's soul that recognizes like we are approaching something. Something seems to be like the end is coming. Like, why is that? That's what I would say that that's all about. Yeah.
Awesome. Um, what is one piece of advice that you've received that has been useful to you that might be useful for others?
Um, Not taking myself so seriously is what comes to mind immediately. You know, I've spent a lot of time invested in apologetics and feeling like, especially coming out of certain Protestant traditions, you feel like evangelism is what represents the fruit of your salvation. Like if I'm not converting people, then there's something wrong, and in Orthodoxy, you start hearing from, the lives of the saints, and will speak with various priests, and there's just such a different spirit there. There's still a sense of urgency, um, but it's not so much. I mean, the way that the enemy works is to kind of manipulate you into feeling like you're being pressured into something. You're either being emotionally manipulated or mentally to feel like this is something you got to do. And in Orthodoxy, it's more of an offer. It's more of a, something Saint Seraphim of Sarov said is that acquire the spirit of peace and thousands around you will be saved.
That's one of
And
my
that
favorites.
that makes so much more sense to me than standing on the street corner with a megaphone screaming at people about the end of days. You know what I mean? Like in scripture, that's not what changed people. It was seeing that there were these people that were one way, and then their lives were changed. They became different somehow. That was what the primary tool of evangelism was in the Bible and in the early
Mm.
church. How is it that people are like going to their violent deaths and they're like calm? What's going on? How is he so peaceful? What is this spirit of peace I keep hearing about? And so that's, I think, the main thing that I'm trying to internalize is, we can get so hyped up and eager to want to just change everybody and save the world that you forget it's more about just the own inner work that needs to happen. Work on the inner self, get that right first. People will notice, and that's going to just do things that you didn't even plan on.
I love it. Um, if you could put one if you could put a message on a billboard, what would it be?
Oh man. um Probably something about the Orthodox Church. I don't know how I would word it, but it's such a hidden treasure. Like people, when people say, or they ask why aren't more people Orthodox, if it's the truth, if it's the one true church, and my answer to that is, well, I widely, because people are just ignorant of it. They
Yeah.
literally just don't know that it exists. I had not even heard of it until 2018. I assumed all of Christianity was Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, and that's where the story ends. And I don't know how that has happened. I think naturally, because America is a younger country, and this is a religion that has dominated in the East for 2,000 years and didn't get here until, the 1700s. And it's outnumbered by Roman Catholics and Protestants. Uh, a lot of people just don't know. So if I could come up with some clever way to slap that on a billboard, then I think that's probably what I'd do, because there's nothing else more that matters to me than keeping the spiritual life at the center of all things. I think everything flows from there.
I mean, you kind of did it. Orthodoxy is a hidden treasure.
There you go.
That could
Yeah.
be on a billboard. You said that.
Something that doesn't even necessarily, like, it's not a sales pitch like go to the
Yeah.
Orthodox Church, but something that just makes people go, what is that? Just plant a
Yeah.
seed somehow, you know? Yeah.
How about two or three books that you think could be helpful to, or two or three books that are your favorites that you think could be helpful to, let's say men who might be struggling. Don't have to be
Um,
orthodox, and it can be anything that you've found useful.
yeah, sure. You're saying men in particular that might be struggling?
Yeah, let's say, I mean, the podcast is mainly geared around holistic mental health for men. So yeah, let's say.
Okay. Okay. Um, it would depend on what specific demographic.
Well, how
So
about for
if
you?
we're talking men that are, for me, one that I would highly, I mean, it's hard for me not to go the Christian route because I think that the revelation from God that gives us the truth our souls need and desire is like, you can't, separate that from what gives us our mental well-being. Um, One general one that even tons of Orthodox people laud would be Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Tremendous author. Historically, people say he was possibly beginning to even entertain the idea of attending the divine services of the Orthodox Church, I believe, before he passed away. So had he been, around a few more years, who knows, he might have converted. But that's a really good book, Mere Christianity. Um, the way that he breaks things down is uh, it's simple enough that just any average layperson could understand. Don't have to necessarily be super philosophically inclined or anything like that. It's been a few years since I read it. It might get a little heady at a few points, but I mean, it's widely popular for a reason. He knew how to speak to a broader audience. So I would definitely recommend that one. Um, and then the other one that I mentioned earlier, Orthodoxy and Religion of the Future, I definitely would highly recommend that because that covers a variety of spiritual themes and topics, and even gets into the whole UFO phenomena, interestingly enough. So since that's something that's going on a lot right now in the media, I think it would definitely benefit people to understand that phenomenon from the a proper spiritual perspective. Um, and then I think just probably I'd recommend some relaxed reading. For me, my favorite author is a guy called R.A. Salvatore. Very Lord of the Rings esque style kind of literature. I'm not sure, if the listeners are into that kind of thing, but um, just super detailed, very imaginative style of writing. He is widely responsible for my own vocabulary expanding to the degree that it has. Just reading like 30 or 40 of his books really opened up my own capabilities as a writer. So creatively speaking, if you're someone that's, creatively inclined, just reading books that would, help expand and give you some sort of insight into how to structure your own world of imagination. I think that's helpful, and it gets you out of the zone of focusing on whatever stresses you've got going on.
Yeah, totally. I think that's my life is always different when I have some sort of fiction that I'm reading, like just
Yeah.
having that outlet. I haven't heard of say his name again though. RAA.
R.A. Salvatore.
R.A. Salvatore. I wanted to say RAA like J.R.R. Tolkien, but
Yeah.
okay. All right, I'll have to check that out myself. Um, where can people find you, and what might you want to point them to?
So I just recently started my channel, as you were saying at the beginning there. It's called Orthodox Soul. You can find me on YouTube and go to the About if you want to get in touch with me. All my socials are on the About. I don't really use Twitter that much, to be honest, but you can get at me on Facebook or Telegram or email me or whatever. Um, so I'm going to be trying to put together content on there in the coming weeks and months. And thus far, all I have planned for it is kind of, apologetic style videos and doing critiques of various things and um, just kind of doing breakdowns of worldviews. And it could go in, a number of different directions from there, but that's kind of all I have planned for the moment. And I kind of have written out some like comedy skits and things too, but I'll see if I, have time to even get around to those.
Yeah, well, I encourage anybody who hasn't yet watched your testimony to watch that, The Path of Self-Denial. And I did watch episode 0, your introduction from the other day. So, anybody keep in mind if you want to learn more about orthodoxy or get some of these unique perspectives, like I'm sure based on, the testimony, it's going to be awesome and interesting. So go and check that out, Orthodox Soul on YouTube. And we thank everybody for listening. Darian, thank you for taking the time. And if you can just hang on for 1 second while I close out the show. All right. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and head over to risingstronger.com. You can join my growing email list by entering your email address or downloading my free guide, The High Mileage Foods for Better Mental Health Guide. I do offer a free 30-minute coaching consultation. You can sign up for that there as well. And again, I appreciate your time. I'll see you in the next episode.